I was fortunate enough to be on the 2003 study conference with Neil, although we were on different teams that went different directions. The 2003 in Australia and New Zealand, to give you a sense of what we did, the theme around our study conference was around sustainability of communities globally, coming on the back of the World Summit in Johannesburg in the previous year, which was on the back of the 1992 original Earth Summit. So I was the tour leader. I was very lucky, I'm very fortunate, and again, I'm sure Ron had a hand in this, but I was very fortunate to be the study tour leader for the South Australian tour. And through the time we went to have a look at defence facilities. We got to stay in the barracks. We didn't get hotels. Barracks are dry. I'm just going to point that out. So it was a very interesting start to when we first arrived. We went and looked at the Submarine Corporation. We looked at agriculture. We went out to Port Lincoln and looked at agriculture and aquaculture and the development of those industries in regional communities. We had a look at urbanisation in Adelaide, the development of the U-Bahn as a mode of transport, basically a bus that runs on rails and then onto wheels in the city. We looked at Salisbury, the city of Salisbury, which was developed around the use of grey water systems. So the whole community, the whole suburb was built with a waste minimisation and water use reduction principles around it. And of course we had a look at Indigenous communities and the preservation and then celebration of Indigenous culture in and around Adelaide, Port Adelaide, on the back of a conversation with local Indigenous elders about the devastation to the local Indigenous community of the arrival of Colonel Light and the development of Adelaide as a town. Adelaide was never a penal colony, so it was actually one of the best planned cities that we have in Australia. In my group, we had people from Fiji, Kenya, India, Sri Lanka, Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, the UK, Singapore, the UK, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland and England, Canada, New Zealand and of course Australia, and I think that was about the full suite. And we had people from all walks of life. So we had trade union officials, we had government people, we had people out of corporations like myself. I worked at Alcoa at the time. People who work for not-for-profits and in charitable organisations. So it was a very deep and rich experience in terms of the people I got to work with, but also what we looked at in terms of the South Australian tour. I'm going to give you three key learnings that I got out of going on the study tour. The first one's personal. The second one's about teamwork and leadership. And then the third one is actually about the content of what we studied, which is society. So on a personal level, there were kind of two things that the study conference, that stick in my mind about the study conference that I learned about myself. One was I'm incredibly driven and I move very fast. And I can see Neil nodding, so that's probably an honest statement. And what I learned was others take a bit of time to make the logic leaps that I make very quickly. So we would be having a conversation here and I would have moved already to this point, and I didn't realise that it actually was hard for people to follow my logic train because I never explained it to them. I started at A and I got to Z and they had no idea that there was an alphabet in between. So as I went forward in my career, one of the things I learned from the study conference was to actually give people time to follow your logic or follow your path. Some people take more time to process information and come to conclusions of their own and interpret than others. So that was one of my first learnings, and the second one was to be and remain authentic and true to myself. So I've always worked in mining, and I've always been a very determined person to be part of whatever team I was in, but always to be me. So as a woman in the mining industry, to never be a bloke, but always be a woman at the table. As a geologist or as a technical person, to never try to be the management guru, but to always be the scientist taking the scientific approach. And that was certainly brought out for me on the study conference, because that authenticity became very important towards the end. So you imagine you've been together for 2 weeks, and the last 2 days you actually have to present your findings, and you get literally a day to work out how are we going to jam this together and give a cogent message, an outcome to the Princess Royal. And I was in that process, in that pressure cooker, was when I learned to be very authentic to myself and to my own principles. And again, that stuck with me all through, since 2003 in my career. The second part about teamwork and leadership, I learned to ask open-ended questions for people in the team. So I always thought I was quite a collaborative person, and I would always ask lots of, what do you think? What do you think? Where are we headed? Do you agree, not agree? I learned that asking open-ended questions, as in, well, what do you think the consequence of that will be? Rather than asking the question in a, don't you think the way that white Australia has dealt with Indigenous Australia is terrible? I learned to ask, well, how do you think we Indigenous people feel about us, or vice versa? So open-ended questions was really important. And again, as I went on in my leadership journey and became a CEO, it has always stuck with me to maintain open-ended questions. And the second one was to treat everyone. You never know where somebody's coming from in a team. You don't know what their experience base is. And so to treat everyone with the same dignity and respect, knowing that no one person in the team is the brains trust. And that was brought home to me in spades in our end presentation, when we were struggling to try and wrap it around the theme. And in fact, it was the fellow from Northern Ireland, started singing, "Always look on the bright side of life." And the whole room went quiet. And we looked at him, and he said, well, that's what South Australia does. They always look, they're always optimistic. And that he was the quietest person, he was the least contributor all through the 2 weeks. He was the sceptic. He was the one who never really kind of gelled with anybody else, but he was the one who came up with the theme that actually landed our final outcome. And in terms of the lessons on society, I had already at that point been working in sustainability, and in particular in local Indigenous communities. But one of the things that struck me about the diversity of the team that we had was that everybody in the team, no matter whether they were from Kenya, from Singapore, from Sri Lanka, or from Canada, or from the UK, they all responded in the same way about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't have food and shelter and warmth, then any amount of cuddles at the top of that Maslow's hierarchy is irrelevant. And so I guess the outcome from a societal point of view that I took forward in my work going in Alcoa, later in Woodside, and then finally in Toro, was to first address Maslow's hierarchy of needs before you become very intellectual and cognitive with people about how they feel. Because if you haven't got enough food in your tummy, or you're not warm and sheltered, then how you feel about the current energy debate or same-sex marriage is somewhat irrelevant, because you have basic needs first that are not being met. Doesn't mean that you don't have a view, but you have more space to think about those things when your basic needs are met. That was my experience of the study conference, and the theme that we came up with at the end in our presentation to Princess Royal was something that I've equally taken forward in my life. Always look on the bright side of life. I am an eternal optimist. I'll always look for the positive, and I think part of that I learned on the study conference. Thank you.